How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Today I'm going to be trying something new. Not new as in nobody else in the world has ever done this before, but new as in I have never done it before. I made a simple rendering on my iPad of a sculpture that I'd like to turn into a physical piece of art. The first step was to take the file and create an inversion of the shapes. To do that, I made a block slightly larger than the shape itself, and then I subtracted them from each other. What I was left with was a negative and something that I could break down into various shapes to create a mold. Once it had been broken down into its different parts, I formulated a game plan. Once all these pieces have been created and put back together, it should look something like this. To make this, I will be using some pink XPS insulation foam. The first step was to build 2 of the walls and the floor of the mold. I'll be using a combination of utility blade and hot wire for this build. It was important to keep things nice and exact, more so than I would usually be inclined to do. Rather than just jump straight into the interior shape, I started with the 2 walls and the floor so that I had something plumb and established that I could work off of. This will keep everything aligned, and I'll be able to add those 2 other walls at the end. The next step was to make the bottom section, which required multiple layers of foam all cut precisely to the exact same size and shape, which the hot wire table is perfect for. I'm constructing this thing upside down, so the bottom of the mold is actually the top of the room. So I had to round off this section to create the vaulted ceiling look. And I've seen people use a bandsaw with wood to do this kind of stuff, and a hot wire table is kind of like a bandsaw in some ways. So I figured that the principle would still apply. After gluing the layers together, I followed my traced lines with the hot wire, and then I glued the appropriate offcuts back in place while removing everything else. In retrospect, I probably should have come up with some kind of a jig to make this a little bit more perfect, but after the knife and some sanding, I was able to get it back to a place that I was pretty happy with. Lastly, cut out a little foam dowel and a slightly larger disc to go on top, and that was my first major section of this mold done. I found the right orientation and I glued the piece in place, and almost immediately pulled it out of place because I thought that I had messed up. But I actually hadn't, and I was just overreacting and second-guessing myself, which happened a lot on this project. And something about working in the inverse really had me second and third guessing myself. And as soon as I got back to working again, my wire snapped on my hot wire table, so I needed to replace that real quick. Which didn't take too long, and then I was back in business. From here on, after those few down minutes of mental planning and questioning all of my decisions, I started making great time. I clearly saw the path ahead of me and began constructing the terraced section at the top of the mold. And maybe because of my lazy Coloradan accent, you thought I was saying something else, but I meant terraced, as in having been formed into a number of level areas resembling a series of steps. After getting that large top section with the terraces finished, I moved over to the individual details like the steps and the doorways. When everything had been cut out and dry fit in place and I knew everything was going to work, it was time to assemble. With the construction of the core of this thing done, I could now finally glue the last 2 walls in place. And I haven't mentioned it to this point, but I am using foam-safe super glue to stick everything together. I also used some hot glue along all of the seams to ensure that I would have absolutely no leaks. After that, it was time to clean up the workspace and get everything ready for the main event, which was, of course, the cement. I pulled out an old hobby mat because I'm guessing this could get pretty messy. Online, one of the recommended cements to use for molds was Cement All by Rapid Set, which I was very happy to find at my local Home Depot. My modeling software allowed me to find the total volume of the inside shape, so I subtracted that from the total volume and came up with the exact amount that I needed, which I overshot by about 20% just in case I spilled anything. I began portioning out the cement into smaller containers, and everything was going well, but for some reason, filling the buckets by scooping wasn't doing it for me, so I switched to the pouring method. And you'd think I'd never poured anything from a bag in my whole life. In the grand scheme of things, some spilled cement powder's not the worst. But I spent a good 15 minutes cleaning up my pointless mess before I could get back to work. I grabbed 1 part of water and began mixing in the other 4 parts of cement. On the instructions, I saw that the pot life was extremely short, so I mixed everything as thoroughly as I could within the window that I was allowed. And then I jumped straight into the pour without hesitation. Maybe with just a little bit of hesitation. Once the mold had been filled all the way to the brim, I gave it a little bit of a jiggle, and everything appeared to be going well. Some tiny cracks did start to form, probably because I wasn't diligent enough with my sprinkling of water, but I did that consistently for an hour before going to bed. When I came back in the morning, it was the moment of truth, and I have to say I was pretty nervous about what I was going to find. I've had so many bad experiences with resin. I felt myself enter a state of troubleshooting and damage control. It's just a reflex at this point. The mold was a little stubborn at first, but I used some isopropyl alcohol on those hot glue seams, and then everything started to snap apart a little bit better. And while you enjoy the sounds of me removing this foam, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I got a little overzealous, so I threw on some gloves and used tools to keep my fingers a little safer. Once all the foam was finally out, I used a wire brush to get rid of the bits of foam that had lingered in the cracks and the recesses. I'll have to think through a better setup for working with cement in the future, because this was definitely one of the messiest jobs that I've had on this little workbench. And after everything was nice and clean again, including my little sculpture, it was time to install the lights. You may be looking at this and thinking, that's not a very interesting design. And I recognize that, but I've never worked with cement before. Never made a mold like this, and if anything had failed, it would have been the basics, which is what I need to get good at if I want to dive into more complex designs. Viewing this as a good practice ground to learn a new technique, so that in the future I can implement it in more intensity to come up with something a little more impressive. It's also just a fun piece of art. It's simple, but it's durable. You could prop a door open or hold a houseplant, which is something that most of my projects couldn't do. I wasn't sure how to seal the cement, but you know what they say. The best sealer is the one that you have with you. So Mod Podge it is. Just in case it didn't work, I applied it to a small section on the back first. But once that worked out, I applied it to the rest as well. After the Mod Podge had time to dry, I stuck some black felt feet on the bottom, because this is very heavy and I didn't want it to scratch anything. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.